If you're sick and tired of doing these kinds of exercises for forearms because you're bored, or maybe you're just not seeing results, or maybe they're uncomfortable, we're gonna go over 4 untraditional forearm motions, at least motions that you don't tend to see, with a cable today that you can do instead of this dumbbell stuff if you're looking to either spice up your forearm training, or just if you're looking to introduce something that's new or novel to seek improved results. Now, before we do that, I want to just briefly go over some of the problems that we run into with the dumbbell stuff. So oftentimes people will orient themselves off of the bench like this and they do their curls and extensions. But what they don't realize is that a lot of the time, simply holding the implement with the fingers is a lot of the problem. And when we look at doing extension, like wrist extension type stuff, all the tissues that actually organize your ability to hold this in terms of the, not unfolding at the fingers, run on this side of the forearm. So if you have to stimulate and just handle a ton of motion on this side of the forearm, and you're trying to manage motion and create output through the opposite side of the forearm, those tend to be two conflicting sort of signals that you're providing to your brain, and you're having to manage multiple things at the same time rather than just being able to load at the hand moving this way. Now, we run into a somewhat similar issue in terms of managing the hand when we're trying to do curls this way. Why? Well, as a quick test, I want all of you, just as hard as you can, curl your wrists and see what happens. And what you'll notice is if you have a strong fist to begin with, you can only get so far keeping that strong fist. Why? Well, because the muscle length of all the tissues that run from the finger across the wrist are way too short to be able to get into that fully wrist bent position. So what you have to do is you have to actually let go of that, and a lot of times your strongest position at the wrist is a position where your fingers go straighter, and vice versa for the other way. So we talked about the extension based work earlier. Notice what happens if you try to actually keep your fingers straight and you go this way. You can't get really far and it feels kind of weird and weak. But the second that you let your fingers bend, you can get much further and you can extend your wrist much more powerfully. So the reason that a dumbbell might not be the best option for forearm training is specifically because of this relationship between the fingers and the muscle lengths in the fingers and the muscle lengths on either side of the wrist, and as a consequence, the output that you're able to create when you're forced to grab something. So what can you do? You can use a cable, and specifically a D handle. So let's jump into a couple different variations, 4 different ones actually, that you can do to maximize forearm growth in every single direction. All right, so the first 2 variants that we're gonna go over, one is kind of a wrist bendy thing, and another is kind of a wrist deviating thing. Now, for those of you who don't know, there's wrist deviation, which kind of goes side to side, and then there's wrist flexion and extension, which is one that's more kind of like this. So you have this motion and this motion, and we wanna train both directions for both the extensors and the deviators, which are technically called radial deviators. And then we want to train separate motions for the flexors and the ulnar deviators. So ulnar deviation, radial deviation, flexion, and extension, those are the terms. And that's what we're really trying to optimize for with the cables. So if I want to train ulnar deviation, i.e. the deviation of the pinky sort of tucking underneath and up to the bottom of the elbow, I need to be able to grab something to actually have a lever off of which to do that. Why? Well, because if I just put my hand in here, then the handle is going to slide around and I'm not going to be able to actually shove into anything. So what I need to do is I need to find a position where I can grab the handle, and for reference, this is kind of what it looks like, and wrap it around the handle here. And then what I can do is I can place my opposite side hand as an anchor on top of the actual top side of the forearm. And so what I do from here is I'm able to actually use this opposite hand for stability as I curl down against this weight. Now, what you'll notice is that from a mechanical standpoint, this is heaviest at the bottom and lighter at the top. So something that I can do to sort of account for this is actually put the cable behind me, and now I can actually make it so that it's heavier at the top and lighter at the bottom. If you can't see that, heavier at the top, meaning a longer distance here, and lighter at the bottom, right? So what I like to do is I like to brace with my opposite side hand and basically just grab the handle and do it this way. Now, we talked about that whole dumbbell issue and specifically how to avoid that. What if we're trying to train wrist flexion? Well, what we can do with any kind of D handle is, instead of having to grab this like a dumbbell, we can simply loop the hand through like so, and just load the wrist so that we don't have to worry about the finger stuff, right? And we essentially apply that same logic, anchor on top of the hand, right? So we're not forced to sort of manage this at our elbow and our shoulder. And then all we do is just simply move the wrist underneath of that. Now, many of you will be surprised at how much weight that you can actually use in any kind of flexion-based wrist exercise. Like, I'm just gonna slap this all the way down there. And the reason is because this point of application where the load is a lot closer to the wrist as compared to if you had to sort of, hold it in your hand, right? You can shift the strap closer to your wrist. But what you'll notice is that you're so much stronger than with any of those dumbbell variations, because what you'll notice is that there's not this weird limitation on your grip the whole time. So my advice to all of you would be to make sure that you just completely remove the webbing out of the way, or, and this is, I don't even really go to this gym, and this is what I found. Like, I just found a random strap that looks like it's for an ankle, wrap that around here, and just simply use it to push against, right? So I can loop my hand through, and much like in the other variation, I can angle backward, right? So it's farther here, and as I extend downward, that cable, notice how that cable actually gets closer to my forearm, right? So this actually feels really, really good. This is just like an ankle cuff. You can literally get any ankle cuff on Amazon for like less than $10, and I'm just letting my fingers move. I'm not really constraining any motion within the fingers. Why? Because again, that whole length tension thing, and specifically how clunky motions get when you hold this position in either direction. Okay, so that's the flexion stuff, the wrist bending, and then the deviation stuff, in one direction at least. So how would that look if we were going the opposite direction? Well, same principles, no different. All that changes is the direction of resistance. So we go all the way to the bottom. Now instead, we loop this way, right, underneath. And now what? Opposite side of the forearm. And now all we're dealing with is an extension-based thing this way, right? So same exact thing, different direction of resistance. And now what some of you may start to notice is that in this direction, this will start to slide. So rather than having it this low, play around with the height and play around with the angle, right? So now I can kind of face this way, and I can use this forearm against my hand thing again, and I can sort of turn myself into it so that I'm not sort of forced to allow my wrist to sort of sneak out, or my hand to sneak out, right? So there are a ton of ways to set this up in terms of your body's relationship to the load. And notice that I didn't constrain myself just simply to having the cable lower, right? So I turned, I did it this way, right? And that's perfectly fine. Find the comfortable position, find where that thing can stay nice and stable on your arm. And then lastly, just to do the reverse and to sort of complete the picture as to what we did earlier, or in relationship to what we did earlier, you can do the deviations in the opposite direction. And now keep in mind, right, so earlier we did this direction, which would be called ulnar deviation. Now this is radial deviation, which is essentially motion of the thumb sort of up toward that elbow. And for this one, you gotta be a little bit lower here. And what you're gonna do, grab that handle, again, just like we did before, make sure it's consistent with the strap. And for this direction, I actually like to go this way, right? So grab all at once and make sure that that webbing is nice and wrapped around that handle. And then from there, underneath of the arm, curling up, deviating this way, right? So it's essentially just finding ways with the cable to stabilize ourselves, load ourselves in the appropriate direction, use something like a cuff or the webbing in the handle to load the actual wrist directly instead of all the different finger muscles, right? And then just basically finding a way to consistently continue to load that over time, which with a cable stack is quite easy. Now, if you are stuck with dumbbells, you are stuck with free weights, it's not the end of the world, and you can still make some serious progress just doing those basic wrist motions. But I would highly recommend, most commercial gyms have a cable stack. Planet Fitness is $10 a month. It has a cable stack. It's well worth the investment, in my opinion, at least in a lot of cases. But if you are practically constrained, I totally understand there are circumstances where that is the case, whether it be a distance issue, getting to the gym issue, time constraints, whatever. Using a dumbbell is perfectly fine, and going over those exact same motions just with your hands slumped off the end of a bench is perfectly okay as well. So if any of you have any specific questions about any of these motions and troubleshooting them, I'm happy to address them in the comments. Please let me know how I can help.